Ladies and gentlemen, in this RedGamingTech.com video, we're going to be discussing memory of the Xbox 720 and the PlayStation 4. This question comes to me via Facebook and asks why people are so excited with the amount of memory the PS4 and Xbox 720 has when they are 16 times the amount, which is around about the ballpark figure that you expect as a jump from each console a generation. For example, the PS1 to PS2 had a jump of 16 times. That would be 2 megabytes to 32 megabytes. Same for PS2 to PS3, once again, which was 32 megabytes to 512, which is, of course, 16 times. Indeed, the original Xbox One to Xbox 360 had a jump of only 8 times the amount, because the Xbox One had quite a large amount of memory for the time, 64 megabytes. And so the question is, this person has, I won't mention his name, why people are so excited about the fact that the PS4 and Xbox 720 have 8 gigabytes when it's only 16 times the amount of previous consoles, and people are claiming this is like a massive amount of memory. Well, there are a couple of things to note on this. It's not a 100% easy question to answer. It comes down to a number of contributing factors, actually. The first of these is the fact that it's unified memory. Now, unified memory isn't this magical cure. And Mark Cerny and, the people behind the PlayStation 4 do kind of go overboard with how just awesome unified memory is, but it does have advantages, particularly in console architecture. Now, the basic premise of unified memory is that unlike non-unified, you can allocate memory however you would like between the GPU and the CPU. This, in effect, gives developers a lot more control. Now, the PS3 came under fire because you couldn't simply allocate memory however you wanted it, which you could for the Xbox 360. That isn't to say the Xbox 360 was flawless, however. It too had a limitation on the amount of memory. You've also got to take into account that the Xbox 360 and PS3 were starting to get actual memory overheads from the operating system, which, as it turns out, the PS2 had a small overhead, of course, and PS1 had a very tiny overhead as well, but certainly nowhere near the impact of the Xbox 360 or the PS3s. And while, of course, the PS4 does have its own overhead as well in terms of its operating system, and most likely the Durango will have quite a big one as well. It's apparently going to be using a derivative of the Windows 8 OS, so it's possibly going to have even a bigger overhead than, say, the PS4. But so the unified architecture of the PS4 is definitely one of the things that they like about it. The other thing, and this isn't really to do with the subject of this particular video, but it is one of the answers, so I'll go into it regardless, and you guys could check out another video if you really want a more in-depth explanation on this one, is actually memory bandwidth. And it's all well and good to actually have a lot of memory, but if you can't shift the amount of data that you need around the system, it doesn't matter. In this case, both systems are taking quite different approaches. Well, we think the PS4 is taking a different approach to the Xbox 720. We don't really know yet, because obviously the Xbox 720 has not been even confirmed. In fact, we're calling the Xbox 720, for all we know, it could be called Fluffy Cloud. We simply don't know yet. If it is actually called Fluffy Cloud, by the way, that is actually the best guess in the history of the universe. But regardless, if you take a look at the Xbox 720 and the PlayStation 4 especially, they are able to shift a lot of data around, and this is something that previous generations of consoles weren't really able to do, at least so effectively with a unified architecture. There have been a number of systems that did it fairly well. The GameCube actually had pretty damn great memory management, because it actually had a decent amount of embedded RAM on the dies, but regardless of that, it wasn't really enough for high resolution textures, and the Xbox One had pretty good amounts of memory, but the memory bandwidth specifically on the GPU wasn't really that high. With the Xbox 360, you had a unified approach, although as far as I understand it, the memory read and write wasn't quite up to the developers' expectations, but it just simply wasn't a bigger part of it was that it just didn't have enough of it, although it did have that embedded RAM. I believe it was 10 megabytes, which did help somewhat. So memory bandwidth is a huge deal. Obviously, the Durango is apparently going to be utilizing the 32 megabytes of ES RAM, combined with the move engines, which are basically, once again, I've done a video on this as well, but just to quickly summarize it, the move engines are pretty much there to move data around very quickly without impacting the rest of the hardware. So in other words, it's effectively a free operation, especially if the rest of the hardware is being fully utilized. Despite the fact that theoretically, at least, given the leaked specifications, move engines could theoretically move data a little bit slower than, say, the shaders could, but obviously the shaders, utilizing those to move data around isn't really the best use of those shaders when they could be doing other things such as compute functionality. Now I've actually managed to breathe after all of that sentence, we can then move on to something a bit different. So I mentioned earlier that one of the things was bandwidth, the other thing is the unified approach. Now, unified in this case is great for developers. Now, on PCs, unified isn't really the way that we actually care, because as it turns out, DDR3 memory is coming up to a slight limitation. I'm not saying it's fully limited, but we are becoming bandwidth constrained, although as it turns out, some applications are more bandwidth constrained than others. For example, some rely heavily upon latency. Now, I've actually done another video, you knew I was going to say that, didn't you? That said, the title is PC and Console Memory Overview, different types and how they work and so on. And that actually goes quite heavily into the different latencies and so forth of memory. So if you guys are curious about that, I suggest you watch that video. It doesn't really go so much into the unified thing because I want to tackle that in another video, because I have a feeling I'm going to have to do quite a bit of research to get all the images and other bits and pieces required to really make it completely illustrated. Anyway, so yeah, in terms of processors, however, PCs work because the processor itself, although we are getting to the point where we are saturating the PC's memory bandwidth in terms of like the main system RAM, the GPU, which would be either from AMD or NVIDIA, of course, has its own system memory basically built straight onto the board, and in fact, it's even got its own level of cache as well, come to think of it. And this amount of memory has a ridiculous amount of memory bandwidth, and it's basically an enclosed system. So if you think about it, they have, say, 2 gigs of RAM, which is more than sufficient to hold the textures of, say, 1080p files, 1080p games at the moment. But that isn't really the case for, say, the Xbox 360. Let's go to that for a moment. Even if the amount of memory bandwidth on the Xbox 360 was sufficient, if you were to look at the console itself, there are a couple of problems with it. First of all, the rendering now was a big deal. The GPU it wasn't really up to snuff in terms of being able to render at 720p, which was what Microsoft were originally aiming for. But for later titles, of course, they had to stop knocking down the resolution simply because the GPU couldn't keep maintaining that resolution at that speed. It's like if you've got a PC, you have a choice. You can either drop down the quality of the graphical options, so for example, turn down texture quality, lighting quality, whatever, or you can turn down the resolution options, or you may have to do both if your system's quite old or what have you. On the other hand, with the Xbox 360, it was a double whammy effect. First of all, the GPU wasn't fast enough, but there was actually something a bit more profound, and that was the amount of memory. I've mentioned a couple of times about Dishonored. When it was being created, developers actually wanted it to be a bit more intricate than it originally turned out to be, but it just turns out they couldn't do it. They just didn't have enough physical memory on the system to be able to implement all of the stuff they wanted to. Of course, I don't know what they eventually cut out. It could have been missions, or it could have been background scenery, or maybe even AI. It could even have been something like NPCs. We just don't know. So, how is it then that this jump from 512 to 8 gigs is so revolutionary when we've actually had these kind of jumps before? Well, it comes down to another thing as well. If you actually look at the amount of memory on PCs, say, I don't know, at the time of Oblivion's release, which of course is an Elder Scrolls game, the the prequel, of course, to Skyrim. And I was gaming on that on 2 to 4 gigs of RAM because I actually played it a couple of times with different levels of system upgrades. But first time I did was 2 gigs of RAM, second time was 4. Okay, now that's 4 times the amount, even if you go with 2 gigabytes, and that's discounting the GPU. Now the GPU I was playing with at the time, I believe, is an X800 XT, I think, which was from ATI. That wasn't AMD at the time. Now that sucker had 256 megabytes of memory on it as well. So straight away, even if you discount that though, let's assume that just doesn't exist. And let's just talk about main system RAM. You can see that right there you've got 4 times the amount. And of course when I upgraded to 4 gigs of RAM, which some people already had by the way, as this was around 2006, 2005 kind of era, some people had got 2 to 4 gigs of RAM. And to be honest with you, we as PC gamers have been on 8 gigs of RAM for a long time. And there's a couple of reasons behind this. One is the fact that, to be honest, a lot of games now are actually, ironically enough, still on x86 architecture, which is 32-bit. And I've mentioned this in another video, actually the PC memory one. I should probably make a video actually going into the 32 and 64-bit. Actually, someone remind me to do that because there was actually quite a lot of other differences. It's not just that, hey, we can address more memory. But suffice to say, the 32-bit limit on a lot of games still exists, and it simply is that they are not able to address more than, well, it's actually under 4 gigs of RAM as it turns out. But even if the game is 64-bit, and most aren't, but even if you assume it is, most PC gamers have easily been able to make do with 8 gigs of RAM for a while now, and it's actually most of the memory is actually being taken by the graphics now. Especially if you are one of those gamers who plays on like triple monitor setups, and obviously for the most part they are in the minority. Most people play on, say, one 1080p screen, and they will have whatever amounts of anti-aliasing and anisotropic filtering they can have on their game, and so forth. So you may have, say, 2 gigs of RAM on that GPU, or 1.5, or 1, or maybe even 3, depending. As it turns out, right now, 1.5 to 2 gigs of RAM is more than enough to display 1080p footage. And so, to be honest with you, in terms of pure memory, we've not really moved forward in gaming for a while. So I think one of the reasons developers are so happy about this is the fact that they will actually have as much memory as PCs right now. Now obviously, that isn't to say that PCs only have 8 gigs of RAM. Some people have 16 gigs, some people have 32 gigs. However, we are not talking about what you can have. We are talking about what benefits you. Now, obviously, some games will benefit you more heavily than others with larger amounts of memory. And as it turns out as well, because you're a PC gamer, well, you may not be a PC gamer, you may be a console gamer, but let's say me, for example, I sometimes game and I have, I don't know, multiple web browser tabs open, like a ridiculous amount of web browser tabs open, and I sometimes have image editing software and video editing software, and of course, even if I'm recording a game for you guys, I've got audio recording software open, Steam's open, web browsers are open, the actual recording software is open as well, and various other bits and bobs, and so all of that is eating into system memory. Regardless, you can still get away with 8 gigs of RAM on PC. In fact, you could technically get away with 4, whether, to be honest, you're probably going to start running into swap file issues in those cases. For those of you who are unfamiliar what swap file is, I'll quickly go into that. Although I would recommend you watch the PC and console memory overview video if you really want to know more. But basically, all that a swap file is a case where you run out of main system memory, and so a virtual amount of memory, if you will, is created on a hard drive, and that's expandable. And it basically starts to page stuff to that allocated space, if you will, on the drive. It is substantially slower, however, the main system memory, because obviously you are relying on a mechanical medium rather than, say, memory. But it's better than your PC crashing because you're not got enough memory, right? It usually does that to older programs, by the way. In other words, programs you haven't used in a while, it won't do it to a fresh application. generally, unless you're really memory limited. Anyway, so yeah, basically that's the other thing as well, because now we're starting to get to the point where we are able to display images at a decent resolution, and we won't actually be memory limited. And a couple of developers have actually said that the Xbox 360 is still a decent console. It's just, quite simply put, that they do not have enough memory on the damn thing. So there's, as I've said, it's not really a 100% easy answer. I guess it's a case of PCs haven't moved on 100%. Definitely in 2 to 3 years' time, I wouldn't be surprised if we start to become slightly memory constrained on consoles. But I think for now, however, it's not going to be that much of a big deal. There are also a number of other benefits as well with these new generation of consoles, mostly in the way they handle compression on the memory side of things as well. And that will obviously become quite a big factor, and I'm pretty certain the Durango will have a hard drive that's standard. I imagine it will. It's been pretty much confirmed anyway, and no doubt that will also be used as temporary storage, because the Blu-ray drives, they just can't stream data fast enough to read, even if you get a 6-speed drive, because obviously a lot of people have been saying, well, why can't you stream when, say, the PS3's drive is, I don't know, 2-speed, and okay, it has to rely on storage space on that, but why can't a 6-speed drive work or whatever? It's still a hell of a lot slower than a hard drive, and you've also got to take into account the other big thing. Textures are becoming a lot larger. And so all of these contributing factors, you know what, this is going to sound a bit maybe harsh, but although I really am looking forward to the PlayStation 4 and Xbox 720, I think some people are getting a bit carried away with the specifications. And I know I've actually got accused in a couple of videos of coming down a bit hard on the consoles. Maybe not hard, but being a bit almost down on them, I suppose, is the best way to put it. However, the reality is they are not going to be an incredible innovation in terms of the amount of memory. It is definitely the amount that I expected. And the fact that the PS4, I'm not going to really talk about the Xbox 720 here. Not because I don't like the Xbox 720 or whatever. I just think it's unfair to really talk about the Xbox 720 because it's not even confirmed yet, so we don't really know 100% specifications. Regardless, in terms of the PS4, the other major benefit is simply the fact that it is very fast memory, and I think the other big thing is that all the specifications actually match up. I do wish that PS4 does have a faster CPU in it, but that's a different story entirely. So I think that's just about answered the question. It's been a bit of an all over the shop video, but I think we've gotten there in the end. It's been a bit of a short video, at least for mine. It's literally about half to maybe even a third the length of some of my videos have gone. But anyway, once again, if you want more information on the PS4 or the PC or memory in general, I have one video, PC and console memory overview. I'll try and link that one, and I have a couple of others going into the memory bandwidth and so forth. You also might want to check out the analysis of the Durango move engines if you've not already done so, and you could also check out the Mark Cerny interview analysis as well, which would give you quite a lot of information too. Anyway, I think that just about does it for this particular video. I really appreciate, by the way, the recent Facebook comments and so on. I am really loving it. It's absolutely fantastic. I know I didn't answer all of your questions to the person who asked this question. I don't want to mention your name on, when this video could potentially get a couple of 1,000 views. But I will have a look at the rest of them tomorrow, most likely. I had a pretty bad gym session today, so I'm pretty damn tired, so I wanted to do the quick one today, if I'm honest with you. Anyway, hopefully that will take care of that, and I will hopefully see you soon. Take care, and bye for now.